What's up, guys? This is Jason, and I've been involved with a large app, and I had to figure out all kinds of new stuff. Everything from what Flux is, to one-way data flows, to smart versus dumb components, to having a single app state, all wrapped in ES6. And I had to figure out what all this meant with a large team of developers, and I finally got it to where I can explain it in really simple terms. And this video is for developers who want to understand how to make real-world, large-scale apps, but need to understand some extremely core fundamentals that are basically going to apply to all JavaScript apps kind of moving forward, at least at the time of this recording. And that's the idea where you have basically what's called a store or a state, which kind of manages the state of your application. How that gets moved into what's called a smart component, and what does that mean? What dumb components are? How is that structured? And then how do actions get fired, which therefore then update the store again. This is how React and really Angular applications should be built. But as you're kind of going through this, learning about it, you see all kinds of charts like this, and you go, that's great in concept. A store updates a smart component. Yeah, cool. What does that even mean? That's not code. How does that work? I'm going to show you code for a production level app that is just getting started, and it's at a perfect level to show some concepts. This is what the app looks like, and basically all it means is that when you click an item up here at the top, it closes this little sidebar thing. And that's what it does. And I'm going to show you, this is an Angular 1.4 application using ngRedux with a Redux backstore using ES6. And I'm not going to go through really like the technicals of how it's built. I'm going to talk about the high-level concepts while showing code so you understand how to build applications at scale. Because once you can build even this one little tiny example, building on top of it is all the exact same thing. What will happen, going back to my chart, is you're going to have more smart components, more dumb components, and more actions. That's it. As you build up your application, you'll still have one store, and you just get more of these, but they're all doing the same thing. Your store just stores more data. You're going to have more smart components which receive that data and pass it to the dumb components. When I say data, it's not just what text to be shown, it's also functionality, it's functions, it's methods. It's saying, hey, dumb component, when you click on a button, here's the function you should fire when that button is clicked. So you pass a dumb component a function, and then it just fires. The dumb component doesn't know what that function does. It just goes, okay, I'm going to fire it. The smart component then takes that function and then may fire off an action, which then updates the store. But you're going to have just more versions of these three things. And that's what makes a really large scale app. And so this kind of infinitely scales. So I'm going to show you and kind of explain what this all means, because I could have used this video as I went through this. And if you are a developer getting into either React or Redux or Flux architecture, maybe a little bit of ES6 or even Angular, the 1X series, these concepts are going to be so helpful because it's basically how all apps should be created, generally speaking. I'm going to speak in general terms because this isn't tailored towards Angular developers or React developers or whatever. It's just general architecture principles for building JavaScript client-side applications. So let's get started. So the first thing to kind of recognize with this is let's take a look at what actually initially happens. And so you're going to have something like this. Now, ES6 is all about importing, and what that basically means is like loading a file. So you're used to, putting script tags in your HTML. You can think of it like this. You're saying, go off, load this file, and just make it available to me. Now, those files may be things like just like a jQuery library. Like here's an example. Make this one underscore variable the entire contents of the file. So this could be jQuery, and this would be a $sign. You're used to that. So you can do something like that. You can also say something like if this file does something like, say, exports a function, where it could just say, export function foobar, and then somewhere else in the file you have export function blah. You can say import foobar from this, and then you have access to the foobar variable, which is that function. So that's ES6 modules in a nutshell. You're just basically grabbing functions as well as whole files Depending on, you'll see a different kinds of syntax here. Some are common JS syntax, some are ES6 syntax. They're just ways of writing it differently. What's happening under the hood is I started this with the gulp Angular generator, and all that means is that it wires up Babel for you, which takes this file, runs it through Babel, and you get plain old JavaScript out the end. So that's what's this is how things are kind of being brought in. Now, you're used to, if you're using Angular, you're used to kind of seeing this kind of syntax here. And what you're seeing is just a normal config block with passing in, whatever that happens to be in that file. And you can see, the nice thing about this is you can see exactly where that's coming from. So if we were to drop into that config, and I'm not going to edit this just so that you can see kind of what the actual workflow looks like. That's here. And what I'm doing is I'm bringing in a few other things, and I'll talk about these when I get to them. Right now I'm just going through the flow. So let's just start at the beginning. What we're doing is this ng-inject is specific to Angular. It's just, you can go and look into ng-annotate and read up on what that does and how it makes certain things available. But I'm bringing in ngRedux, and here I'm creating the store. Now, going back to our chart, this is what's important. Here's the store. Where does the store get created? Well, you can see here, this thing's created before anything runs, before Angular even initializes, before the run block fires, before routes get resolved, everything. We're creating the store. There aren't multiple stores. The idea of Flux, I should say with Redux specifically, is that you have a single store, and this is what stores your app state. Now you might be going, okay, what is app state? What is it? It's a plain JavaScript object. So if you look into the console and you want to actually see what the store is, I'm just going to reload this. And I pull up what it looks like. Here you go. It's an object with the 3 properties: cart, products, and sidebar mode. If I open up products, it's an object. It's got a property and another property called products, which is an array. Array's got a few items. Here's more stuff, and it just goes down, down, down. That's what your app state is. It's just a JavaScript object. So I am creating basically a JavaScript object right here. And then I'm not going to go into the details of what how to do Redux or ngRedux. You can read all about that through the docs. Just understand kind of how the things are constructed. So you're creating the store at the beginning. I also happen to be passing in some middleware. I'm not going to go into what middleware is, but that's what enables the logging for what we're seeing. Okay, so once we go into the config gets run, let's kind of step back here. So there's config. Then we're also passing in kind of the router. Now this is a key thing to understand how routes work with, especially with Angular apps. And it's the idea of, and I didn't get this at first too, how to really use abstract states correctly. And so in this particular case, you'll notice that our root URL, and I'm not going to go into Angular or UI router, you can read up about how that works. But the important thing to know here is that the root URL is part of a state that is a child state. The most top level state that you would normally think of is actually a child state. Well, child state to what? It's a child state to this state up here. And this is defined as abstract, which means you can't actually navigate to it with a blank URL. This gives us the opportunity to say that whenever you go into any state in the app, even just /, you can do some stuff. And in this case, what's important is we need to go off and fetch some data from a JSON file to initially bootstrap the application. So we're firing a function here, come down here, and the important thing to know with this is we're basically calling this connection right here is not needed, actually. That line we're not using, so that can be deleted. This line is what's important. Oh, sorry, this is how we get actions. Okay, so this is what we're doing. We're looking through, we're saying, hey Redux, go through all of your actions file, and just merge whatever you find in that file with this object. That's what this line of code does. And so it's just going to make all of the functions that are in that actions file available on this object. which gives me the option to fire some functions that are on that object. Now you might be looking at this, and this is one reason why ES6 is so good, is where does this come from? Like, you see shield actions, like that's cool, but where is that from? That's the beautiful thing about ES6, is it's explicit. Scroll up to the top of the page, and you can see I'm bringing it in from a file. I am bringing in all functions as this variable from this file as a relative location to where this file is. And I won't go into what that is just yet, but these are the functions, and you can see I'm just exporting function, etc., just like I talked about. Okay, so this is what gives me access to the actions, and now I'm just saying, now call bootstrap. So what this is doing is for any route that we go to, in order for this route to be resolved, the abstract state must be resolved, which means this file will load, and this will do the initial fetch. Now remember, because every other state here is a child state, this other abstract state won't get reevaluated, which means only the initial fetch will happen even as you navigate around the app. And that's why the abstract state is so important. Okay, so we are calling bootstrap. Well, what does bootstrap do? Well, let's head over to actions. And again, you can look, we'll go back, reference the chart, right? We have our actions, and that's kind of how it works. And then actions just updates store, so it kind of works like that. There's your one-way flow. It's this triangle right here. Dumb components, you need to understand how that works, but it actually just is underneath smart components. But there's your one-way flow happening right there. Okay, so we have actions. So let's go take a look at actions. And this is saying actions.bootstrap. So come over here to actions.bootstrap. And this is cool because in Redux, what I'm doing is I am typically an action simply is, you could think of it like an event. And the way you broadcast an event or action is you return an object. And the only thing that, obviously when you broadcast an action, you got to broadcast something, so you broadcast a string usually. That string I happen to be put into a constant just so that we could stay consistent, but you could type just a, some string right here. So these are all the actions, and they're just returning an object, and the string has to be set onto a type. That's a convention for Redux. But that's the only thing required. You could send other data along with it. So in this case, this one's got a mode. This one doesn't have anything. This one's got one property. So you could send other data with it. That's called a payload or a value object. Or you don't have to. Okay, so those are for these functions. But in some cases, I want, well, what if I would need to be able to have an action call another action, or do an asynchronous request, or do something like that? Well, fortunately, Thunk is what enables that. And you remember I brought that in previously. But that just gives me the ability to do this. I can return a function instead of an object. And it happens to provide the dispatch method from Redux, which gives me the ability to dispatch other actions or just return functions. So that's what I'm doing right here. This is how you do an asynchronous request from a Redux action creator. You basically return a function. And that function is going to, in this case, return fetch. Fetch is not a widely supported ES6 API, and so we're polyfilling it, but that's where this fetch comes from. This is part of ES6. It's kind of like, even though this is Angular, we're not using, this is not Angular code. There's no $HTTP. There's no jQuery here where you can do $.get. This is how we're doing an asynchronous request with ES6. So there's our fetch, gets the data just like a regular promise, and I've got it. You can watch my video on promises to understand what that's doing. And then we're doing, once we get the data, then we're just firing off a method called dispatch and saying, here's the event, receive initial data. The cool thing about how this works is that every exported function becomes available as an action in Redux. So I'm saying receive initial data is the function to fire, aka event to fire. This is the function which is receive initial data here. And that just returns, the event that occurred. And then I'm passing that, just the JSON, with a function that's going to do a bunch of mutations on the data just to get it to look like how I want, add some extra stuff, that I need. And so that just broadcasts the event. Now that, if you remember here, the action broadcasts the event, but that doesn't actually update anything. That's just saying, hey, I received some data, here's the data. That doesn't actually get into the store. I could say, drew a circle, and that's the event. That doesn't mean that the store is going to respond to that. The store can choose what to respond to or not and control that. And so I can fire off toggle sidebar and say that the type was toggle sidebar, but that's it. That's not updating the actual store. That's just saying that it happened. So that's what these actions are, is they're not really doing anything. I mean, this happens to be fetching the data asynchronously and saying, hey, I got it, but that's not doing the update. So to actually do the update, that's where the actual store is. And well, what's the store? Well, in this case, that is the reducers. In this case, to understand what this is you remember how in our store is basically a single JavaScript object, which looks like this, right? So we have one object with 3 properties. That is what the store actually looks like. And this reducers file is what makes that object up. Every function in here is a property of the store. There's cart, there's sidebar mode, and there's products. Now you may go, but you have other functions in here. Like, great, there's cart, there's that one, and there's products. But what about this get toggled sidebar mode? That didn't appear in app state. Well, that's because down here at the bottom, this actually is which ones to include in app state. And that gives you the option of using functions from these functions without having them be included in an app state. So you can see here I'm saying take the cart, take the products in the sidebar mode, make that the app state, and these are the functions that actually get put in app state, and therefore that's what makes the object. So if you look at this, the really cool thing is, let's just take a look at sidebar mode. And sidebar mode is just a number, right? So this is a sidebar, 0 is that, 1 is that, and I don't know, that's 2. It's just a number that represents its current state. So coming over here, if we go back to our actions and we say set sidebar mode, again, all it's doing is returning an object. I don't need any asynchronous or function or anything with that, and all it's saying is, hey application, set the sidebar mode to whatever I passed in. So then in our reducers file, this is basically what handles that event, and then therefore updates state accordingly. Now you can watch Dan's video on how Redux works to get all of the details on why I'm setting an initial value, how this works, what the philosophy is for why I'm returning the same state that gets passed in, as far as how all of this actually works. Go look at Redux. That's just what that is. It'll cover all that you need. But in a nutshell, I'm basically saying, look at the type that gets passed in, and then determine what it is, and then return its part of app state. Now this function, the part of app state that it is responsible for, is all of the data inside of the sidebar mode property. So inside of our app state, let's pull it up again. You look at app state. Inside of sidebar mode, it just has the number 2 in it. And so this function, as well as the state argument that gets passed into it, is just the value of sidebar mode. You don't get access to the whole state. It's just its slice of it. So in this case, what I'm doing is when we get the event set sidebar mode, if that is what action.type is set to, that's passed in, then return, and whatever you return here, that state for this function's area of focus is what it will be set to. So in this case, I'm setting it to just the action.mode, which is what was passed in from the action. Okay? So this function gets fired by whatever fires it, and we'll go into that in a second, passes the mode, and then grabs that mode and just returns it. And that's what sets sidebar mode to that, and how we're setting it. So that's kind of how you set data with actions. And you can see everywhere from if we receive the initial data from that one bootstrap call, then we're just returning 0. There's the default. And that's how the reducers fundamentally work. And you can call other methods, like you can see down here that if toggle sidebar mode was the actual event that was fired, then I'm returning the value of whatever this function is, and that's just another function. So one key takeaway from this is that down here with one that's a little bit more complex, you need to, and this goes into understanding Redux and one-way data flow, but you never ever modify what's coming in. And so I happen to use a Lodash method here. You can use ES6, whatever way you want to do it. But you don't want to modify this object, so state. So what I'm doing is I'm making a copy of state. And then I'm modifying some things in it and then returning the copy as a whole. So I'm copying everything about the state, making some tweaks to it, and then returning a whole brand new different object that is a modified version of whatever state was. And that is the philosophy behind these. So when state comes in, you don't modify what's coming in, you make a copy of it, you tweak it in whatever way you want to tweak it for that particular slice of the state, and then you return that entire thing. And that is the philosophy of Redux and how to manage your store. So actions fire, the reducers fire, modify app state, or the state, the store, whatever you want to call it, returns the new state for that particular piece of the whole state. And that's how you update data. And you can have actions fire other actions. So over here, you can see an example of that right here, where one action is just firing another action. Here's an example of an action getting some data and then firing an action. And here's an example of an action just broadcasting that the action happened. So there's your actions and your store. And that covers the hard part. That covers your actions and store right there. So then there's this idea of smart components. And a smart component is, now whether it's React or Angular, it's in Angular it would be a directive. In React it would be a React component. But a smart component is what actually gets the data from the store and gets access from and is able to call actions. So that's what the store is. I'm sorry, what the smart component is. And there's usually only a handful of them. And when it has data, then for instance, a smart component might be the entire page, and that's the component is the page component. It might be this entire sidebar might be a smart component. It's up to you how you want to make it, but the sidebar is just which component gets the data. The reason that you only want one kind of top level component to get data is because it makes understanding where the data is coming from easier. And so that's what you want to do. Okay, so looking at an example of a smart component, let's take a look at the options controller. Now in this case, in this particular application, I'm not using a directive as a page component. So if you look at the route, and we just come over to, let's just take this one for example. I am attaching a controller as this to the one unnamed view that I have. And so this controller is acting as a component in this case. I mean, that controller is here. It is a smart component. It has a template. Even though it's not a directive, it is a component, and it is a page controller in this case is the same as a component. And that's what it does, is it gets the data. So down here, the one thing to understand with ngRedux, and the key to understanding all of this, is this one line right there. And so here's what this is doing. This is saying that I want to take all of the actions that are available in the actions, as well as, and basically make them available to this object, whatever you pass in there. So in this case, I've simply said that this controller has a property of Redux, and this entire controller is placed on scope because I'm using controller as. So I'm saying this property, which I happen to call Redux, is right now an empty object. So I'm saying merge in with this empty object whatever actions you get from there, which is a variable from here and is imported from that file. So that covers the actions. That's what makes the actual actions in Redux available on scope so your stuff can call it. I could create other functions in here and call them. You do it however you want, but that's what makes it available, and from that point your components down and everything have access to it. So that covers the actions. For the data, does the same thing. We need to add the data to this object too, and that comes from this. And that is this function, and we are returning an object which actually has access to the entire state. That's the entire state tree, so all properties on it. And I'm just saying which pieces of the state to map to which properties which become available on this object, which is now on that, which is on scope. Now, you probably are looking at this, and this is really new to you. If you're just watching this at the time of this recording, this is when ES5 is still more common, where you see this import and then export class, and there's a constructor here. You got to be familiar with, to a degree, object-oriented programming. But basically, when you export a class, the constructor function is what will fire always right away. And then any other functions declared like this are available on this object. And that's what the syntax is. But that ES6, classes, you can read up on that. But that's how it looks in Angular with ES6. And then I'm using this little ng inject again. That's ng annotate, and you can read up on what that's doing. So this is what's making it available. So this is the smart component. Well, the template for this, if you remember, as a sign-in UI router, goes into options. And so all I'm doing here is rendering two dumb components. Now, going back to our chart, the dumb components simply get data passed to them. It has no knowledge of Redux or the actions. It knows nothing about the methods that are inside smart components. It knows nothing. All it is it goes, what functions do you want me to fire? And you must give them to me. And what data do you want me to display? And you must give those to me. And so if we were to take a look at the cart, and the cart in this case is this little sidebar thing here that I can close and expand and toggle and stuff. This is the cart. That's this component on line 3. So if we were to look at that, you can see that I'm saying, when you click the close expand button, and the close expand button is what pops in right here. It says close expand. You are going to fire this function. Now remember, this is the controller that's made available by right here, controller as option controller. That makes this template have access to this controller as that. And then I'm getting access to the Redux property, which is right there. This is this controller, Redux property, which is an object that I've merged both the actions from here and the data in app state. So I'm saying fire off this particular action called set sidebar mode and pass in 0. And that action, going back to our actions, is right there. Set sidebar mode, passing in 0, which fires the event, which updates the reducer. All the reducers get fired, actually. So every single one of these reducers is evaluated when that happens. Some may care, some don't. In this case, this one cares. Sets sidebar mode, which is a property of app state, and it goes if set sidebar mode, then it's going to return the mode that was actioned, or the mode that was on that action that was passed in, setting the sidebar mode property in app state. That's how that flow actually works. So if we go into, or back where we were, so that's saying when you click that button, you're firing that event. And that is what actually fires the event. Now, the fact that it closes is something else. But that just means that if I come over here and I bring up my console, let's just clear this out, and I come over here and I expand this, and I expand it, click on something that expands it, clear this out, you can see that if I click close expand, that's what fires the action. And then I can see what the previous state was, and you see sidebar mode was 2, which was the full size one. What the action was, and you can see it was set sidebar mode, and it passed a value object or payload of 0, which therefore then set sidebar mode to 0. And so that's what's actually setting app state. Now that doesn't mean that that's going to make it move, but it's setting app state correctly. So then I'm also telling this component what to do when you click the expand button, and it's the same kind of deal, passing in a function. What to do when you click the toggle arrow, same exact deal. and then what the actual mode is from app state. Now this is the key. These first three were functions to fire. This last one was saying, hey, here's what the actual app state value of the sidebar is so that it can respond accordingly. So that's it. I'm telling the cart, going back to our chart, DOM component, what three methods, things to fire when you click on certain things. Again, this DOM component, this cart doesn't know what those are. It's just going, here's a function. Okay, I'll fire it when you click on something, and it's done. And then also here's what the sidebar mode actually is, because it always just reflects whatever the sidebar mode is. It doesn't actually, when you click a button, it just goes, I fired a function, and I will always reflect and whatever you tell me the sidebar mode should be. I'll just be open or closed based on that. So that's how this one-way flow works where you're passing it to DOM components. In looking at the implementation for the DOM component, this is a standard ES6 Angular directive. And if you're familiar with Angular, this will look familiar, but the thing you need to understand is that here we're passing in the mode, binding to that object, and that's the two-way binding that Angular provides, so that the mode on scope becomes available to it. Then we're passing in those three functions, and that's how you pass in functions in an Angular directive. The way you do it in React is different. Here's the template, and that's it. There's nothing else here. You'll notice that I am, there's one utility function that I've added called getSidebarClass, which just returns a string plus whatever the number is of the mode. That's all there is. You look at the template, super simple. Here's what actually makes it expand. If you look, there is an ng class right here, and it uses that utility function. So basically it's going to say, mode 1, mode 2, or mode 0, mode 1, or mode 2 as a class on this element. That's it. So when you go to Cart, you can see here, this is Sass. If you're not using Sass, you should fix that. There's no forgiveness for not using a precompiler with CSS. There is for JavaScript, but not for CSS, at least not at the time of this recording. Anyway, so that is saying right here that when those classes are added, then just change the width. That's what makes it move. The animation of the elements behind it using ngIf, using ngAnimate, how this fades in, fades out when you do that. That's as simple as saying start here, end here, start here on your way out, end here when you're done. That's all it's doing. And then obviously enabling transition. That's automatically handled by Angular, which is nice. So anyway, when you click an option, it is firing a method down here, which is saying, hey, you clicked an option. Again, it's a DOM component. It doesn't need to know what you're actually doing, right? DOM component just firing a method. And so it's firing clicked option, which again is just an action that was available just like any other action. And it's saying clicked option. And all that's doing is dispatching two other events. Chosen option index and set sidebar mode to 0. That's what closes it. And so what you would do in a real application, and the key takeaway in this, let me go over to the next module, is that you would simply add more pages to the route, right? You have more states. You can have child states. You can have child views. You can assign controllers, which would be your smart components. Those don't have to be your smart components. You could have other components there that act as smart components. You can mix and match. You have your smart components. Those smart components just pass data down to DOM components. DOM components can pass data down to other DOM components that it received. So this DOM component could simply have another DOM component, and it would go like this. And it would actually be two-way if it's calling actions. If it's calling data, it wouldn't be. So just do that, and you keep going. So you can have as many of these three here as you want. And you just keep adding more and more. And again, you can modularize your actions, break them out into separate files, organize them however you want. You could theoretically have multiple stores. You generally don't want to do that. You will generally have one, but again, you can break them out, at least from a logical standpoint, in the file to multiple files, multiple methods, combine them however you want. But this is the architecture of what one-way data flow is all about, whether it's React or Angular, and how you would actually do it. And so the keys, again, to recap, Make sure you're using an abstract state that acts as a parent for your entire, for all of your main states and child states all the way down. And that could be one module, and you can have multiple modules in Angular and do it however you want, but that's generally how you do it. And that's what allows you to do initialization, if you need to, of getting some data on the page. And again, these states could also do that. And child states could also do that. So you can nest it however deep you want to go. And then from there, you're going to have your, your actions are going to fire. In this case, Bootstrap, which is going to therefore update the reducer, which is actually what's going to set app state right here. So these are all the reducers are going to fire. Everything listed in here fires for all events. If those particular reducers care, they will check to make sure that they do care, and then they'll modify state in whatever way they need to. Your smart components are going to have access to app state as well as the actions, and then it's going to pass both that data that it got from app state as well as the actions available, make them available on scope, which allows you to pass them down into dumb components. They can use them, they can fire actions, and that's how your app is made. And you can scale this infinitely for large and small apps alike. So that is generally how it's done. I hope this helps kind of explain the ideas of one-way flow and Flux and using a single state or store with Redux or Cerebral or whatever other tool you want to use, as well as smart versus dumb components, as well as how certain things are wired up with ES6 and kind of what it looks like. But even though the technologies will change and a lot of the coding conventions will change, the philosophy of this chart is starting to become standard in the JavaScript industry, at least as of the beginning of 2016 when this was recorded. The idea of having a single store with smart components passing data down to dumb components is starting to become prevalent everywhere. So there you go. Hope it's helpful to you as you kind of try to build apps out there, and we'll see where stuff goes.